Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
Wednesday morning. It's always good talking on Wednesday, midweek.
The Wednesday is good for a variety of reasons, including it gives us a little more time before our Friday DM Zoom, which means instead of kind of rehashing the DMZ conversation, it's 48 hours for maybe even longer for something new.
What's it rehashing instead of augmenting?
Or I would say a deeper dive, the parrot room phenomena. But it is also fun. By the time we do the DM Zoom on Friday, there will be new things to talk about that we don't even know about. There'll be a press conference, Bill. Joe Biden is going to hold a press conference, and that's a show, as George Costanza might say.
So on this Wednesday, we're in another news cycle in the. I don't have the answer. I have to explore it. Did you have any schoolwork to do? You've done all your schoolwork? This is their independent work day. So I was like, I did my work.
Another great thing about doing it on Wednesday.
Yeah, Wednesdays are. I'm sorry, so I'll pick up where I left off. So on this Wednesday, we are in another extended post-mass shooting news cycle. Second mass shooting in the past 2 weeks. Now, we haven't been in one of these for literally a year, maybe a little more than a year, but it was a year, almost to the day a year ago, when the last public mass shooting of 3 or more people occurred. I don't think the one in mid-March 2020 was of enough carnage to crowd out what was going on with the pandemic. So our conditioning of the national trauma that we go through, had faded, and now we're kind of jarred back into it again. But we're still in kind of a predictable cycle where we are mortified. Democrats say it's time for action. Republicans give thoughts and prayers. Democrats scoff at thoughts and prayers. But there's nothing on the table that has a chance of making it through Congress. At least not.
You're assuming that the main conversation is gun control. And I think that definitely is true on the mainstream media. But there's also the identity politics angle.
Well, for the Atlanta shooting, I mean, it's interesting that the Atlanta shooting did not spark a gun control debate. It sparked a debate over treatment of Asian Americans and the rhetoric that
which we don't know. I mean, it's still debatable to what degree race played, but that didn't stop the media narrative from focusing very much on that question.
Well, I think that, number one, even if the shooter in that case wasn't directly motivated by anti-Asian hate, which I know the sheriff said the shooter said he was not. I know the investigation is still ongoing there to try to, pin down what the motivation was. I think Asian Americans who have then shared their stories of discrimination over the past year and beyond the past year has been fueled, by the China flu, Kung flu, talk from Trump. I don't think that negates I don't think that negates the experiences that have been shared, and it presents an opportunity to reflect what have we been doing as a society in the past year in that regard. And others have made the point that if what we hear from the shooter is true, that he was driven by a sex addiction, and he then chose massage parlors that had Asian staff, that does indirectly bring in all these stereotypes that people have about Asian women and so forth. So you can't fully erase the fact that the victims were Asian. It wasn't totally random.
No, I agree with that, Bill. I agree with that, and I suspect that it's a combination of things. It's a nuanced thing, but I do think the media wanted to create a narrative that this is more evidence of conservative white men being the biggest domestic terrorist problem facing America and targeting Asians specifically, which to some degree indicts Donald Trump and his irresponsible rhetoric. And that actually may be a stretch. It's not clear that that's the real story, or that that's the dominant story, that it deserved the becoming what I think was kind of the mainstream media narrative for a while. And this matters, right? I mean, the stories we tell ourselves about life impact the public policy decisions we make, and impacts public opinion, which impacts public policy decisions. And so I don't know. I think that part of it's a media story, part of it's about identity politics, and the Boulder shooting. Let's suppose that it had been a white male Southern Baptist who did it, and let's suppose that by happenstance, a lot of the victims had been Asian or African American. It seems to me that we would be now in a feeding frenzy, perpetuating this narrative, which it may in a larger sense be true. Like, we may have a problem. I think we probably do have a problem with white supremacy and domestic terrorism and racism, but that doesn't mean that this particular shooting, as horrific in tragedy, reinforces that narrative.
I suspect, and look, we should be careful. I don't think there's like a group of like 5 cable TV editors that jointly decide here's what our stories are going to be. We talk about the media all the time, but it's not as top down as that. The media often is absorbing some bottom up reaction and making decisions on what they think their audience wants to talk about. So we're not in those rooms where the decisions are being made. So I just want to be a little careful that we're not sounding too conspiratorial here. But I do think that in general, I think controversies around race tend to supersede all other controversies when it comes to decisions made by TV networks what to talk about. They are, they're at once both very important and also very good for ratings. They engender very fierce debate and emotional conversation. They rarely get resolved in a neat way, and you can always go back to it and stir up more of that conflict. I think in the case of the post-Atlanta aftermath, we haven't really had much discussion about anti-Asian racism. So it was healthy, regardless of what the specifics of the shooter's motivation was. It was healthy to have that conversation because we barely had it. But you never can fully separate out the social value component and the capitalist component of what TV stations do. In the Boulder case, even though the shooter is Muslim, if this was a Republican president, if this was Donald Trump still president, you might see a lot more push towards making this somehow an Islamic terrorist thing, even though there's zero evidence that that was a motivating factor here.
What I heard and was, like a history of mental illness or some recent examples of mental illness.
So you're not, since the president and the leaders in Congress are not twisting that narrative into something advantageous to them regarding to Islamic terrorism, and the media is not jumping to that conclusion. When the brother came out very quickly and said this guy is clearly mentally ill. He's talking about being paranoid for the years. I mean, it seems sort of classic paranoid schizophrenia. That became part of the narrative, and then so with race taken out of the equation, we're in a more traditional gun control media narrative. And
I think that's probably fine. The only point I would make, and then I'll shut up about media bias, is if a white Southern Baptist had been in the shooter, it wouldn't have mattered that he had mental illness. The media would have driven this as a confirmation of a larger narrative. And if you're interested in this topic,
yeah,
because I know we don't want to have this devolve into a media story, but I just interviewed Bernard Goldberg yesterday for like 45 minutes. We actually did not talk about the shooting per se, but we talked a ton about the media bias, cable news, all that. Check that out if you are into this topic.
But I want to add an important wrinkle to what you're saying, though. Look, when Dylan Roof massacred African Americans in a church, that understandably kicked off a very large conversation about racial animus and white supremacy and white nationalism. I mean, it would be malpractice to not talk about that. It was very plain that it was stated that was the motivation. When you have a mass shooting in a white, rural, conservative area, for example, there was that small church in Texas that was shot up not too long ago. So it's white shooter, white victims, white conservative rural neighborhood. You don't get the same kind of extended conversation about any of these topics. You don't hear as much about gun control because the people affected in that community don't push gun control. The times we've had the biggest "this time is different" sort of narratives are when the community involved is a more liberal community. Sandy Hook, Parkland, perhaps Boulder. Boulder's sort of an interesting case in that Boulder itself is very, very liberal, but Colorado has plenty of conservative pockets and a long-standing gun culture. Whereas you go to Sandy Hook, suburban Connecticut, outside the fact that Connecticut has a history of being a gun manufacturing capital,
is there a reason why it seems that Colorado, I'm sure this is not an original observation, it seems that Colorado has been especially, I think, at least three major shootings in Colorado that, I'm sure more, but three in your top 10 list, three of them are Colorado.
Columbine, Aurora. There was the Planned Parenthood shooting, which I don't think killed as many people, but also got a lot of attention.
Is this a coincidence, or is there why Colorado?
I literally was intending to do this. I haven't done it yet. Mother Jones keeps a database of public mass shootings, and I was meaning to go through and see if Colorado does actually have an outsized proportion of these. So anecdotally, you would think so, and it is a state that at once has a long-standing rural gun culture, but has also rapidly suburbanized and become more progressive. So you're having that culture clash in Colorado more so than I think in a lot of other states. I don't know if that literally I don't know if that drives the individual shooters, but I think the reactions.
Maybe this is a Washington Monthly piece for Bill Scher. It would be. I mean, it's a very interesting question.
But there was a shooting, if I remember correctly, in the Clinton years that happened at a child care center in California, and that's what precipitated the Million Mom March, which was one of the first big gun control protests. And again, that happened in an area that was not a conservative area, so the people affected are much more motivated to talk about gun control. In all these cases, so when people say this time is different,
yeah,
it often is not different. There's nothing about the broader politics of the country that are different. We remain polarized on this question, just as we always have, and we don't have enough consensus in Washington to overcome the various legislative obstacles, filibuster being a big one. But it's not solely filibuster, because Democrats are not wholly in sync on the question either.
Joe Manchin,
the difference is the reaction of the immediately affected communities. That's what often is different, not the broader politics.
Now, Joe Manchin did a TV ad at one point where I think he shot, was it Obamacare? I forget what it was. He shot with the whole ad is him like target shooting a bill, but also didn't he sign on with Toomey for some version of gun control at some point?
No, I have a piece coming on the Washington Monthly, I think later today, where I talk about this, because there are certain things that are different right now. I don't think necessarily enough to actually pass legislation, or at least I don't get wholly write it off. That's still a big long shot. So there are certain things that are different. One thing that is different is Democrats are not only in power now, but they actually ran on gun control to some degree. I mean, it wasn't Biden's top issue, but Obama was really sotto voce on guns in 2008.
All right, now you're talking about, this goes back to our conversation, I believe, last week.
Yeah.
Where you, in the wake of the 2012 election, Mitt Romney loses again. Republicans have the autopsy. They decide that they need to do immigration reform. There's a drumbeat even on the right for doing immigration reform. Hannity says he's for it. Rush Limbaugh is kind of open to it. They pass it through the Senate. Then Newtown happens.
No. Your chronology's off here.
You tell it.
So, let me put a pin on that, because I want to cover Manchin first. Let's do Manchin, and we'll get to the immigration issue. So keep in mind, Democrats passed gun control under Bill Clinton. They passed Brady Bill. They passed assault weapons ban, 93, 94. Joe Biden is integral to those bills. The assault weapons ban is part of the crime bill, the very controversial crime bill. But there's already a backlash to it right away. And there are people in the Democratic Party at the time that felt that they lost Congress in the 94 elections in part because of the assault weapons ban. When you get to 2000, Gore is pushed by Bill Bradley. Now, by 2000, you've had Columbine. You had Columbine in 98, if I remember correctly. So gun control is back on people's minds. Gun show loophole was the big thing. And
the gun show loophole is if you're a store, you have to run a background check to sell a gun. But I could sell a gun to my cousin as an individual without having to go through that rigmarole. And at a gun show, it's treated the same way.
It's treated like the family way. It's treated more informally. And if I remember correctly, I think one of the guns in Columbine was purchased at a gun show. And that's why that became such a big deal. Now we have not just a gun show loophole, but an internet sales loophole, which is even wider than the gun show loophole. So
what's that?
You don't when you buy a gun off the internet, you don't do a background check.
That seems to be that's a pretty big loophole, isn't it?
Exactly.
Not that I mean I don't know if we even know of I don't know of any incidents where that's how shooters purchased the gun, but it does seem to be a big loophole.
So, so by 2000, Bill Bradley is running against Al Gore for the Democratic primary. He's pushing Gore on guns. Gore says he's for a ban on cheap handguns. He says he's for gun licensing. That becomes controversial in the general election. So Gore tries to downplay it by then, but
licensing is just,
like a driver's license.
If you're a conservative, licensing, the whole thing, I don't want to say the whole thing, but for mainstream conservatives who are not nuts, the reason that we would oppose what sound like common sense reforms is not that we oppose the common sense reform specifically. It's that we're worried about a slippery slope. And the sense, I think, was that licensing opens the door for confiscation at some point, and so give them an inch, they take a foot. I just wanted to, for those who may not, that's part of the ethos or the psyche, I would say.
And I think that's as much as some people might say, you're full of it, Matt Lewis, or conservatives are full of it for making these slippery slope arguments. That's the main reason why your 90% support for a background check bill in polling tends not to sustain once you get to the details of a specific bill, because then those slippery slope arguments come in and some of that softer support starts to diminish. So anyway, Gore loses Tennessee, his home state. He loses West Virginia along a Democratic stronghold. Democrats start to believe guns, as well as the environment, are hurting us in some of our traditional, reliable states. John Kerry runs in 2004, Massachusetts liberal. He tries to.
I'm here to get me some ammunition. Wasn't that a line?
He went duck hunting in the last week of the campaign, which some thought was overdone, seemed phony, even though Kerry claims to actually be a hunter. They lose again. Democrats get really skeptical about guns, and there's actually a political scientist named Thomas Schaller who wrote a book called Whistling Past Dixie, where he basically said, hey, Democrats are getting killed in these states on God, guns, gays. They can't do much about God and gays. Those are important Democratic positions, but they could sacrifice guns. They could downplay guns, and that would help them in places like Colorado, places like Ohio or Iowa. And in the 2006 midterms, a good number of Democrats take back both houses of Congress with the help of several candidates who run on fairly gun-friendly platforms. And that seems to validate the Schaller argument. So when Obama runs in 2008, he does not talk about guns. The Supreme Court has the Heller case where they ruled that the Second Amendment gives you an individual right to own a gun, and Obama does not criticize it. He gives a very careful statement where he basically says, hey, I know what works in Chicago doesn't work in Cheyenne. You have him in his first term. You have Aurora. You have Gabby Giffords and the Arizona shooting. And there are heartfelt statements made, but there's no big push for gun control in Obama's first term. He does not run on it in 2012. And so Joe Manchin in 2010 has his ad Dead Aim, where he's loading his gun in slow-mo, talking about his NRA endorsement, and then shooting Obama's cap and trade bill, dead center. And he wins that election. So then San Diego Cameron's in December 2012, right after he wins re-election. And it's Joe Manchin, who ran on being the NRA's candidate, who reaches across the aisle to Pennsylvania's Pat Toomey and comes up with the Manchin-Toomey bill, which is much more narrow than what Obama was talking about. No assault weapons ban, no ban on the size of your ammo clips or anything like that. It's a background check bill only. It's meant to close the gun show loophole and to close the internet sales loophole, but it leaves a carve out for friends and family, which your Democrats weren't thrilled with, but they said, hey, this is literally the best we can do here. But the NRA does the slippery slope argument. This is going to create a registry. Government's going to have all your information. Manchin said this is not true. They're making this up. But enough Democrats vote to filibuster it, people who aren't around anymore, that even though a few Republican crossover votes occurred, they came up short. And so you have this very narrow bill. It still can't happen. So number one, it shows that Manchin, this is probably the bravest thing Manchin's ever done in his political life. I mean, you can say that Manchin is willing to bend over backwards, to help people in West Virginia on, populist grounds, try to steer more money their way or something like that, or he wants to be a moderate for moderate's sake, so he looks like he's an independent person. This is going against the grain of West Virginia. He lost the NRA endorsement over Manchin-Toomey. He did not have to stick his nose in this one, and he did. He made it so central to it because he tried to solve a sticky problem. And not to say that his bad thing solves everything, because it most certainly would not, but he was trying to do something. And so even today, he remains the linchpin of any bill you might get on this issue, because he is from a very gun-friendly state, and he's not going to pass any old gun control bill, even if you abolish the filibuster. Democrats just passed a bill in the House, not the broadest bill, mind you. It's background check stuff, but it doesn't have that family friends carve out, and so Manchin doesn't like it, and it got almost every House Democrat. So you talk about the Democratic Party changing. The fact that you don't have any more Colin Petersons anymore, the more conservative Democrat from rural Minnesota. You have Jared Golden in rural Maine, who voted against both the bills, and there's one other Democrat, that was Ron Kind in Wisconsin, who voted against one of the two bills. Every other Democrat voted for it. That's different than the way Democrats used to be situated. And now, so Manchin's kind of like the last person left standing here, because even the other rural Democrat, like John Tester's a rural Democrat, but he voted for Manchin-Toomey. He voted in that filibuster. So you're not going to get anywhere without satisfying Manchin here. He's still your upper bound of what can be accomplished, and that doesn't even guarantee you getting 10 Republicans. So that's the Manchin. So Manchin is an example of what is not different in this story. He is still the linchpin here. What is different is the Democratic posture. The Democrats post-Sandy Hook are much more forthright about talking about gun control. Biden did talk about it in the campaign. They did talk about it at the convention. I mean, not in the most prominent way, but, more than it had been. And it is a more suburbanized party. It's a more college-educated party. That white working class voter is less and less Democrat, and so it's not driving Democratic positioning as much anymore.
Yeah. So the other difference, Bill, is Obama had immigration teed up to tackle. Right now, Joe Biden doesn't. I mean, infrastructure and raising taxes are really the only things he can do. It's not like he has, even though we have a crisis on the border, it's not like Biden has an immigration bill teed up that he and that he thinks he can pass. So there isn't the opportunity cost.
Right.
Obama had a huge opportunity cost when he switched, or when he not exactly switched, but when he shifted focus from immigration to gun control. That's not the case for Biden.
And just to put a fine point on that, and get back to where we were before, I mean, in early December 2012, it was already being covered in the press that Obama was ready for full court press on immigration. They had a whole rollout plan for January. They had Sean Hannity saying it's her pathway to citizenship. They had Speaker John Boehner saying he was ready to get an immigration reform bill passed that was comprehensive. And San Diego happens mid-December. The focus shifts. Mid-January, you don't have an immigration blitz. You have Obama unveiling a very wide-ranging gun control package. 99% of it doesn't go anywhere. And they spend the next 4 months on gun control, which fails, which gets filibustered. Manchin-Toomey gets filibustered in April of 2013. And on that same day is the day when there's a bipartisan Senate group unveiling their immigration reform proposal. And then we talk about that in earnest. By that point, all these conservatives who are ready to concede thinking that we had no choice but to get right with Democrats on immigration if we were going to win the Hispanic vote. They start hearing Sean Trendy of Real Clear Politics. Oh, maybe we have missing white voters we got to appeal to. Maybe we don't need these Latino voters. Maybe we can. Obama just spurred away all this political capital. We're getting our footing back, we're getting our bearings back. Let's throttle this administration all over again.
Wait a second. Let me stop you, Bill.
Yeah.
Sean Trendy was a smart political analyst at Real Clear Politics. And I remember at the time he argued that it's possible that Republicans could win by turning out more working class whites.
Right.
And at the time I argued, and I believe this is in my book, Too Dumb to Fail, even if that's true, it's a short-term bet. In the long run, it's just mathematically, it's possible in the short term to win an election or two that way. Not a smart long-term bet. But I just want to, it sounds like what you just said is that Sean Trendy was encouraging Republicans, like that he was being an activist, and that
no.
Okay.
He wasn't counseling Republicans to.
That's what it sounded like. But
I didn't mean to suggest that. Just he had this analysis that was published, I think, in November of 2012, saying that the Republican problem is turning out their white vote, not that they lost the Latino vote so much.
So this is an example of where he was right, actually, at least in the short term.
I mean, just in terms of crass numbers.
And ideas have consequences, and it may well be that Trendy's analysis undermined efforts by people like me to get the Republican Party and the conservative movement to actually try to diversify and be more cosmopolitan or whatever the word is, as opposed to populist. And it may be that his analysis was correct, also had negative consequences. But you're not suggesting that that he had an agenda.
No, he did not have an agenda. He was just trying to give a straight analysis of the numbers. And there was a big deep dive by ProPublica, in the aftermath of this, why immigration reform failed, that said that Republicans were coming around to the Sean Trendy analysis by the spring of 2013, and that informed their obstructionist strategy.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So, but to what you were saying, and I have a piece coming out in the monthly that makes a similar point. Biden, it's not as if the Obama team recognized they're taking an opportunity cost risk in shifting gears.
Yeah.
But today, that pressure is not on Biden. There's things that he wants to do, of course. He wants to immigrate. He wants to do infrastructure. Talk about voting rights, of course, and immigration minimum wage.
What they needed, this was like passing immigration for Republicans reminds me of the second impeachment, which is you need a hurry up offense.
Yeah.
Like if McConnell had moved to impeach Donald Trump very rapidly, like a snap impeachment after the insurrection, they might have had a shot. Once McConnell said, well, we're going to let it go a month before we get around to it, I was like, there's no way it's happening. Because then, and I think the same thing with immigration reform. When that the gun control issue bought Republicans the gun lobby time, and things recede. The shock of losing the election to Obama again sort of left, and gravity reasserts itself, and the normal voices reassert themselves, and like the more time you have, the more likely you are for things to go back to the normalcy bias to set in.
Well, why do opponents of a bill always say you're rushing this? Why are we rushing this? Why are you going to do this so fast? Yeah. We should debate this more. We should talk about it more, because they know the longer a bill sits around, the more you can nitpick at it, the more you can throw sand in the air, the more he can stoke doubt and make people go, oh, I wasn't thinking about that thing. Maybe I'm not so sure about that. Maybe we should hold off on that. If you got a hot moment, you got a hot hand, and you got your numbers in Congress, you can get something through before all of the.
It's also hard to argue with common sense. Like in life, you sleep on it. It's pretty good advice usually, right? So it sounds very reasonable to say, let's just study this a little longer. Let's debate this a little longer. It sounds like a very moderate, commonsensical thing to do.
Now, in the case of Biden right now, he doesn't have a hot hand about anything. There's nothing in the queue that he has the numbers right now, he can move fast right now, that he would sacrifice if he shifted to gun control. So he might be inclined to give it a shot because he has the personal motivation. It's been an issue he's cared about for a long time. And perhaps he thinks there's some political upside that I'm pushing for this, and if they obstruct it, then they'll be the ones that take the blame for obstructing it. I mean, he might conclude that's not the right way to go, but there's less pressure that he's throwing away some other issue. Now,
can I ask you one thing that strikes me? I'm not saying this is doable, but if what we've been told about the Boulder shooting, that it had to do with mental illness, is true. And I think I heard that he purchased a gun recently.
Yep.
And I know in the past we've talked about these red flag bills.
Mm-hmm.
So is there something that could be done that would, like, to me, a red flag bill, there is a danger of a slippery slope there, but it seems less dangerous in terms of impinging on the rights of gun owners in the Second Amendment if it was a well-crafted red flag bill.
I would be supportive of it, but I'm not blind to the challenges and the counter arguments. So I don't know enough about the Boulder shooters' backstory and the nature of the purchase to know if a red flag law would have captured him. I mean, if he's mentally ill, but never had mental health services, maybe you wouldn't be in a database that would get flagged. And one could argue, well, if we had a more robust mental health infrastructure and more people getting the services they needed, then you might be able to do the red flag. But then you could say, well, if you're going to get put in some kind of database by getting services, maybe not people are going to go get services. I don't want to be in that database.
Right.
I want to keep my head down. So I don't know how it would all actually work out, but certainly in theory and in principle, I'd be fine with it. And I do think that you do need to have. I mean, the goal to me is a background check system that does catch these situations. So you're not putting a gun in the hands of somebody who's not in a position to handle that gun responsibly. But I want to get back to the timing question, because we talked about this, off air before. You wanted to bring it up again. We talked last show about my point in regards to the filibuster, that a time when it was advantageous to Democrats to have it was to stop George Bush's Social Security partial privatization. And there are various people out there that said to me, that never would have passed anyway. It wasn't popular. It was terrible in polls. Republicans were skittish. And so it wasn't the filibuster that really did it. And you wanted to ask me something about that, right?
Well, and it wasn't ever filibustered either. Like, Democrats didn't actually filibuster
it. It didn't get to the floor. It never got out of committee. It never got brought to the floor.
And it didn't have public support. It was unpopular. And so I guess I would just challenge you. Your revisionist history, I don't know, your take, your insight.
Finding words from a conservative.
Your insight is that that the filibuster is philosophically neutral, and we don't have to go back that far to find an example where Republicans were trying to do something proactively, and that liberals did not like, and it potentially could have done harm, and that because of the filibuster, liberals were able to stop it. And some people say that's not a good example. You think it is?
Well, this is what that argument misses. When Democrats had a voice in the debate from the get-go because they had filibuster power. Once it was mathematically evident they had the power to stop the bill, the media gives that voice more oxygen. And Republicans have to strategize based on that fact. So you look at the coverage around the time. Bush was reelected in November 2004. He's right away talking about spending his political capital on Social Security privatization. But right away, you're seeing...
And Republicans have the Senate at this point.
And they gained seats in the Senate. So Democrats had 45 votes. But still enough to filibuster. So right away, you're seeing Republicans saying, "Oh, we know we can't do this without some Democratic support, and we're not going to get a bill through the House without Democratic support because they're not going to want to walk the plank on this unless they know the bill's going to go somewhere. So we got to find Democratic support somewhere, and so the onus becomes where is that Democratic support? That becomes the nature of the conversation, and by March of 2005." As Republicans are plugging away trying to find that Democrat to break ranks and get that ball rolling, Pelosi is twisting arms to make sure that her moderates don't break ranks, and she succeeds in that. And then on the Senate side, then Bush goes, okay, if I can get someone in the Senate, if I can clear the Senate, then maybe we'll be okay in the House, because then at least we have some Democrats. Even if there was no Democrats in the House, if we had a bipartisan Senate bill, that gives cover to my House Republicans. 42 Democrats sign a letter expressing their opposition to any sort of privatization. That's as good as a filibuster. You have pre-filibustered it. You've shown you have the numbers. And so at that point, they didn't even try. So
I'm hearing some static. Could it be like a plug?
Well, you might be here.
I think that did it.
You might. Okay. One thing I'm worried about, actually, I neglected to plug in my microphone, so I'm a little bit worried about my audio quality. I'll have to listen to it after we're done.
You don't sound bad, but...
Well, to you maybe, but I don't know what the recording's going to sound like.
There is some static. I don't know what it...
Hopefully it's fine, but I'll have to check in a little bit.
But you're basically, it's like peace through strength. Like the threat, it becomes like a deterrent, and it changes the entire nature of the debate and the coverage of it, and even the process.
It slows things down. If you can move quickly because you have the numbers and you have a perception of a hot hand, you can move a whole lot faster. Who knows how important? The public opinion wasn't like 10%. It was more like kind of a split decision with a slight favor to the oppositional stance. But if you can ram this through in January because you have the numbers and no filibuster, number one, who knows what those public opinion polls would say? Because the conversation, the media would be totally different. You'd have all those Republicans saying, "Oh, the stock market is going gangbusters. You're going to make so much money when we do this. You're going to love it."
Yeah. Well, like I could tell you, like when I worked at the Daily Caller, somebody at the Daily Caller would do something controversial, and there'd be an uproar from the media for that person to be fired, and the caller wouldn't do it. We just wouldn't fire them. And eventually what happens is the media doesn't want to waste its time and doesn't want to appear impotent. So they quit calling for the cancellation of people, because if you do so and then nothing happens, then you look impotent. And so I think that there's a similar dynamic at work here. Like, if it looked like Republicans were going to very quickly pass something, creating an uproar of trying to stop it only demonstrates your own weakness.
Well, this is the cognitive dissonance that I feel a lot of progressive Democratic filibuster opponents have right now. When I have these conversations with people, and I've explained, look, there's a reason why Joe Manchin doesn't want to join the filibuster. He has more power as it sits where he is. When it's not a reconciliation bill, like gun control, he calls the tune. Everybody knows if you have any chance for a gun control bill or background check bill, it's because Joe Manchin's writing that bill and driving that bus. Whereas for the American Rescue Plan, a partisan process, a de facto partisan process through reconciliation, Manchin had a role to play. He could tap the brake a little bit, but there's only so much political heat he was willing to take to call the whole thing off just because it wasn't exactly to his liking. And so he did it. He did not write the bill. He didn't he set certain parameters for it, but they were pretty modest.
We got some money for our local hospitals here in West Virginia.
There you go. But the Democrats were able to pass a very, very large bill very, very quickly with a debate that was essentially internal to the Democrats. The Republicans in the broader conversation did not have much of a say, did not have much oxygen to they didn't try very hard, but that was in part because they were defanged by their lack of power in the situation. So the media didn't even go out of their way to find out, hey, what does Susan Collins say about this? As Democrats made very clear, it doesn't matter what she says about it. She can't stop this bus. So when I say, and so some Democrats said to me, oh, well, Joe Manchin, he would never stop this bill. He might be a little performative or might tinker with it, but he wouldn't want to play the role of of not being the 50th vote in favor of something because he doesn't want to take that heat. The same for Republicans in 2005. If there was no filibuster, there'd be a lot of pressure on Republicans. Hey, don't screw George Bush on this one. Don't be the guy that tanks his signature agenda item that he staked a second term on. Again, I can't give you an absolute certain prediction that no one would have broken ranks, but you can see how the dynamics would greatly favor his position in a filibuster-free world.
Right, and he would have had to have lost several votes, right? I mean, he would have got 55.
You would have to have lost 6.
So I think you're right, Bill. I think you make a compelling argument. Let's sort of wrap it up with this question then. Based on, I think we've done a good job of presenting the history of this and the context and where we are at politically, and in a sort of almost dispassionate way, looking at we're talking about a very serious thing, but our job is to talk about the politics of it. Where do we go from here? Like, how do you see this based on all that context that we've just provided? How do you see this playing out now?
On the filibuster or on guns or both?
All of it.
Well,
you got 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, wrap this up.
The filibuster is hard for me. I mean, I'm still kind of skeptical it's going to happen, although I certainly can't discount the possibility. I don't feel like Democrats are quite poised. Biden is open to talking filibuster. Manchin's open to talking filibuster. I think there's a lot of details there to work out. I mean, I think I might have even said in the last show that, or one of the recent shows, that it would require 41 senators to be on the floor. And I'm actually I'm not sure that's true, actually. I mean, I think it would depend a lot on how the bill was written, what would be required of the minority to keep a filibuster going. And I don't believe that the Democrats have that hashed out, or at least hashed out to the liking of people like Manchin or like Sinema or even Feinstein, who's now open to talking filibuster. So they don't seem quite ready there. And even if they got there, it's not evident to me that that's going to make everything else fall into place for them, because they still don't have full party unity on guns, on infrastructure, on immigration, on voting rights. Manchin's being a holdout on H.R. 1. He's saying, even though he was a sponsor of it last time, he's saying, I got to read it now. There's things here that are good, but things that we need to work on. So there's just a lot of uncertainty in the air where things go from here. And while you have, I think, a lot of building pressure in the Democratic caucus for filibuster reform, I think that momentum is real. You also have a group of 20 that's formed, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, and they've met to have nascent talks on immigration, infrastructure, and minimum wage. And you had a Democratic moderate meeting with the White House on minimum wage that started talking about not 15, maybe 11 or 12. So there's these counteracting forces going on. And I don't think one can easily say which one has the upper hand, because there's a lot of difficulty, I think, for both sides.
But I think you could say, I mean, the pressure, and by the way, this makes me wonder, like, what if Donald Trump hadn't sabotaged Republicans in Georgia?
It's a whole different world.
It's a whole different world, right? I just keep bringing that up because I think it's so important. I mean, I honestly think if Donald Trump had...
What if Joe Manchin can't win that seat in West Virginia? What if John Tester can't win in Montana? I mean, there's plenty of things here where
I think Joe Manchin can win. I think Joe Manchin is strong in West Virginia. But what if Joe Manchin drops dead of a heart attack tomorrow?
Sure.
I mean, who knows, right?
Right.
Then it's Senator Mooney. I don't know. That's a different world. But what I was going to say is the pressure on Manchin is, I mean, you know, you have an argument right now, two arguments that I think are compelling if you're a liberal, if you're a Democrat. One is, look, the filibuster is an important tradition, but voting rights that they're trying to take away in these states is a fundamental American value. So that outweighs your concerns about the filibuster.
Simultaneously, from the Democratic perspective?
Yeah. If you're a Democrat, you could make that argument pretty
well. What the Democratic argument is that we are trying to strengthen democracy, and the filibuster is anti-democracy. It's anti-majoritarian. So we should have one of the proposals, we should have a carve out that the filibuster doesn't apply to voting rights because it's so incongruous with democracy. And my response is, you realize the giant gaping loophole you're going to give Republicans when they're in charge.
Sure.
Because their version of voting rights is not your version of voting rights.
Sure. No, but you're making it a mission against interest here. Let me just talk about the pressure Manchin's going to be on. So one of the points is what we just made about democracy. The other one, gun control. I mean, literally, we are getting slaughtered. You know what I mean? Like, Americans are being gunned down, and you're letting the filibuster stop you from. We know you want to do some sort of common sense reform, Joe Manchin. I'm playing devil's advocate here.
But you can say it's almost anything on the Democratic agenda. This is a moral imperative.
Yes.
People are dying.
Yes.
People are in severe poverty. And you're going to let this rule, this musty rule that makes no sense to the average person, you're going to let that stop you from delivering to the public?
Yep.
I think we're essentially at that point. And what I was trying to say earlier, no one wants to listen to me. You are creating an environment where Democrats are going to take all of the blame for any failure here. Because all the things you're talking about, you don't even have complete Democratic unity on these subjects. So, I mean, granted, it might be easier to come out with a compromise if it's just a Democratic-only situation, but not guaranteed. And some of these Democrats want Republican cover. They don't want to go into re-election with only having passed partisan bills. So you're taking a hell of a walk on the plank without being quite sure, people are going to catch you. But I just feel like because the party has become relatively ideologically purified, The demographics of the party have changed considerably. You don't have as much of that white working class, white rural element that you used to have. The internal conversation is very different. And so it's only a very small group of voices. Joe Manchin, Jared Golden, that's about it. Saying, wait a second, there's other parts of the country that you have to worry about. And most Democrats don't want to hear it and don't feel like they need to hear it. And that's leading them to take strategic positions that, maybe it works out. I'm not saying like I am right and they are wrong. It could work out. Maybe that this pressure builds to such an extent that they get talking filibuster, and maybe it doesn't get everything through, but it gets something through, and Democrats say, we delivered for you, and people like what they delivered, and it's a great midterm, it's a great re-election. I'm not saying that's not an impossible scenario. I'm just saying there are plenty of ways that all those dots don't connect. And it may end up hurting Democrats at the end of the day because they didn't set a different bar of expectation going into this presidency.
All right. Well, there you have it. Serious week, serious topics, but I think it's a good discussion.
Well, we'll talk again on Friday at the DM Zoom. If you have not chipped in $1 or $2 on our Patreons or on our Patreon pages, you can always do so.
Yeah. You can be a shareholder.
That's right.
By going to patreon.com / Bill Scher. You can be a Lewis lover at patreon.com / Matt Lewis.
You can be a lubricant.
Lewis Lubricant?
Yeah.
That's going to be a merch item, Bill. If you chip in enough money, you will be shipped that product. That's for the Emperor's Club room. It's a very high tier. Anyway, we won't go there. Check out my podcasts. Like I said, I just had Bernard Goldberg, the legendary journalist, on to talk about media bias, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, cable news, all that good stuff. And Bill,
check out my most recent things in the Washington Monthly. I had the immigration piece earlier late last week, and I should have a gun control piece coming out very soon. And until then, I'll just talk to you on the DM Zoom on Friday.
All right. See you in the DMZ next week. And on the DM Zoom Friday.